Good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started because I'm sure the speakers have a lot to say and I don't want to cheat them of any of their time. I'm Peg Hogan. I stepped in for Maura Ryan, who cannot be here this morning. We have a very full agenda this morning in this program on freedom and death. I'm going to briefly introduce each of the speakers and then just allow them to follow one after the other in consideration of our time. The first speaker is Christopher Fisher. He is the executive director of the Portsmouth Institute for Faith and Culture, a wonderful institute that has some amazing programs, and a teacher in the humanities department at Portsmouth Abbey School. Chris received the BA summa cum laude in politics from Salve Regina University. Prior to coming to Portsmouth, he was previously a program director for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, where he served as associate editor for the Intercollegiate Review and managed the publication's web journal, theintercollegiatereview.com. His articles have been published in outlets including Ethica Politica and in the Intercollegiate Review. John McEwen is a senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute in Ethics, where he holds the Rose F. Kennedy Chair in Christian Ethics. Before taking up the Kennedy Chair, he was university senior lecturer in law and ethics of medicine in the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge. He has produced 7 books and many articles, mainly on law and ethics at the beginning and end of life. His work has been cited by distinguished bodies worldwide, including the United States Supreme Court and the Law Lords. He has also served as a member of the Ethics Committee of the British Medical Association. In 2014-2015, he was the Mary Ann Remick Visiting Scholar Fellow at the Center for Ethics and Culture at Notre Dame. Earlier this year, the University of Oxford conferred on him the degree of DCL, Doctor of Civil Law, in recognition of his contribution to law and bioethics. And last March, John joined us at the Notre Dame Medical Ethics Conference in Rome. Father John Young is clinical professor in Law and Psychiatry Division at the Yale University School of Medicine. He has taught there for 20 years, at the same time holding a position in the Yale State Correctional Institution. Father Young was ordained a Holy Cross priest in 1971. He received his medical degree from Stanford University in 1977. His academic interests are in the interaction of religion, psychiatry, and law. Recently, he co-authored an article on the therapeutic impact of religious robes in mental health, religion, and culture, the ethics of publishing in forensic psychiatry in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law, and the importance of context in the ethics of human subjects research and the American Journal of Bioethics. John has been with this conference since its beginning and has been with the Medical Ethics Conference since its beginning. We have a most prestigious panel. I hope you enjoy their presentations. Chris.
Thank you, Meg. I want to thank the conference organizers, especially Carter, Laura, who had done so much work making this a reality, and of course to my distinguished colleagues here in the panel. It's really an honor to be presenting alongside them. I want to discuss the topic today of suicide, and suicide in especially a modern context. What are the causes, the etiology of suicide? How are we to understand it in its modern social structures? So after decades of decline and stagnation, one aspect of American society is experiencing a crescendo, and it's the rate of suicide. This according to a recent Center for Disease Control study, which found that suicide rates among men 35 to 64 have increased by 30% from 1999 to 2010, and the suicide rate among men in their 50s has increased by 50% in the same time period. I'll note that men of all ages are more likely to commit suicide than women. More people now die annually of suicide than of automobile accidents, 38,364 versus 33,687. Andrew Solomon, writing for the New Republic, reports that every 40 seconds somebody commits suicide. He continues, quote, "In the United States, it is the 10th most common cause of death in people over 10 years of age, far more common than death by homicide or aneurysm or AIDS. Nearly 500,000 Americans are taken to the hospital every year because of suicide attempts. 1 in 5 people with major depression will make such an attempt. There are approximately 16 non-lethal attempts for every lethal one." End quote. Equally sobering are recent calls by physician-assisted suicide advocates for increased access to euthanasia, for people experiencing forms of illnesses other than terminal illnesses, including depression, anxiety, loneliness, and other mental diseases. Articles defending the practice to Western audiences have appeared in magazines from The Economist to The New Republic. This particularly gruesome form of physician-assisted suicide has been kept off of America's shores, thankfully. But in Belgium, for example, The New Yorker reports that people have been euthanized because they had autism, anorexia, borderline personality disorder, chronic fatigue syndrome, partial paralysis, blindness coupled with deafness, and manic depression. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Journal of Psychiatry states ominously but approvingly that the midwife of death is now appropriate for psychiatric patients, representing an emancipation of the psychiatric patient. It is not difficult to see a future where practices are normalized in places like Oregon, where physician-assisted suicide is today legal. So what is causing this suicide epidemic? The Center for Disease Control and most other public health firms point their psychiatric fingers at mental illnesses to be treated as intrinsic diseases divorced from extrinsic factors. The common tendency is to examine the suicidal impulse of an individual divorced from social context, even in cases where externalities lead to depressive states, such as rape, divorce, death of a loved one, or sudden decline in financial position. The diagnoses and treatments to prevent suicide tend to focus on the individual's ability to cope with his or her own suffering, typically in the form of prescription drugs. Of course, suicide is not universally condemned. For some, suicide is an act of individual freedom, where suicide becomes the only effective treatment for the suicidal patient, like we saw in the Dutch Journal of Psychiatry. This is accepted medical practice in the Netherlands, but exists even in American popular culture. When Robin Williams committed suicide, the Screen Actors Guild responded by tweeting, "Genie, you're free," an allusion to Robin Williams' role as the genie in Aladdin. Really kind of disturbing imagery. In both cases, in either the treatment or advocation of suicide, the focus is almost always on the individual. Yet this focus on the individual, I would argue, obscures analysis of what may be the true etiology of suicide, which we will consider here today. In his 19th century classic sociological study, Suicide, Emile Durkheim uses data collected from across continental Europe to suggest that suicide is a fundamentally social rather than individual act. According to Durkheim, suicide, being a social act, is thus symptomatic of a flawed social structure, which fails to integrate the individual into his community. I do not think Durkheim would suggest, nor will I suggest, that the social structures are themselves a direct cause for suicide. Suicide is, strictly speaking, an act of the individual against him or herself. I'm not such a structuralist that I would deny free will. Following Durkheim, I will suggest, however, that social structures may either aggravate or moderate the suicidal impulse. I want to then consider 4 parts in this paper which may help us look differently at suicide and our contemporary social structures. In the first part, I want to consider Durkheim's assertion that suicide is indeed primarily a social act, in that social structures play a particularly important role in the diminution or increase of the suicide rate in a society. And further, that suicide tends to occur when individuals become detached from a web of constructive social ties and traditions essential to human flourishing. The second part will draw on contemporary research to suggest that we presently live in an age of intense isolation of the individual from his community, which may be contributing to increased rates of suicide. The third part will be to survey the philosophy of modernity which governs our social structures in order to better examine the points of weaknesses in those structures. And fourth, I want to suggest that we consider the importance of communal forgiveness in addressing our suicide epidemic and the apparent absence of communal forgiveness in liberal democracy. So the first part. Emile Durkheim, the father of sociology, is in my mind something of a prophet in detailing the consequences of modernity's fractured relationship to community and its implications for the health of society. His work, Suicide, a study in sociology, quite apart from being widely considered a groundbreaking work of sociology, helps the modern reader better understand suicide and its contemporary causes. He saw an answer to the seemingly simple question, why do some European societies have higher incidences of suicide than others? His study implicates the economics, politics, and theology of the societies under his microscope. Central to the Durkheimian sociological formula is what he calls the collective conscience, or the set beliefs, mores, cultural assumptions, and standards of behavior that a society accepts as its own. For Durkheim, the existence of a collective conscience is a fact, not a subjective reality, not a philosophical or religious abstraction, nor a metaphysical possibility, but a concrete fact of social existence. The collective conscience of a society, in a way, informs and mirrors the social structure. Suicide, Durkheim claimed, exposed a breakdown of the collective conscience, a flaw in the social fabric, namely the inability of the community to properly integrate the individual. George Simpson writes in his introduction to Suicide that, quote, suicide for Durkheim shows up the deep crisis in modern society, just as the study of any other social fact would, end quote. So what did Durkheim find in his research? First, he observed that in regards to education, the better educated are more critical of traditional morality, less bound to their community, and as a result are more likely to commit suicide than the less educated. I should point out that the reverse is true today in America, mostly because of an economic observation that Durkheim also makes. The unemployed man is much more likely to kill himself than the employed man. Today, it's hard to find gainful employment without a college degree. Durkheim's research also implicates the family. Men without wives are more likely to commit suicide than men with wives. Men with wives but no children are more likely to commit suicide than men with wives and children. Childless women are more likely to commit suicide than women with children. In other words, the density of the family sets up a powerful immunity against suicide. It is not simply enough to be married, but to have children, and the more children a family has, the more immune the members of that family are to suicide. Durkheim also observed that at times of political and national crises, especially war, suicide is integrated beyond normal towards a unified goal, and thus rates of suicide are lower. Interestingly, Durkheim observes that Catholic societies produce far fewer suicides than their Protestant counterparts. Why? Because the Catholic society more fully and self-consciously integrates the individual into the community with strict standards of conduct, shared communal devotion, a temporal authority above the self, and an institution that mediates the relationship between the individual and God. Durkheim here is worth quoting at length, keeping in mind that he is a secular Jew from a traditional Jewish family, so he really doesn't have a dog in this race. Durkheim contrasts the integrative urge of Catholicism with the isolating tendency of Protestantism, observing that, quote, if Protestantism concedes a greater freedom to individual thought than Catholicism, it is because it has fewer common beliefs and practices. The more numerous the manners of action and thought of a religious character are, which are accordingly removed from free inquiry, the more the idea of God presents itself in all details of existence and makes individual will converge to one identical goal. We thus reach the conclusion that the superiority of Protestantism with respect to suicide results from it being less strongly integrated church than the Catholic Church. He continues, if religion protects man against the desire for self-destruction, it is not that it preaches the respect for his own person to him with argument sui generis, but because it is a society. What constitutes this society is the existence of a certain number of beliefs and practices common to all the faithful, traditional and thus obligatory. The more numerous and strong these collective states of mind are, the stronger the integration of the religious community, and also the greater its pervasive value, end quote. Durkheim uses the contrast between Protestantism and Catholicism as a data point in his larger argument, which is this. As a greater emphasis is placed on the individual in society, the greater that society's proclivity towards suicide. Further, Durkheim's ethical insight is that suicide represents a poverty of moral community and a lack of social solidarity. He called this a state of anomie, or normlessness, a freedom of the individual to define himself that is fundamentally corrosive to social cohesion, and which aggravates the suicidal impulse in modernity. For Durkheim, anomie is a syndrome unique to the modern age, caused by a number of social factors which themselves stem from modern philosophy's focus on the individual at the expense of the community. We'll examine these philosophical roots later. For now, suffice it to say that some of these social factors which Durkheim argues contribute to anomie include the forced division of labor in the industrial age, the disintegration of local political authority in favor of the unitary state, the individualism of Protestant churches, and the disappearance of trade guilds and intermediary institutions. Okay, part 2. The social crises that Durkheim faced are not altogether distant from our own. Indeed, modern research seems to suggest a similarly disturbing pattern to Durkheim's analysis. While cultural individualism has been on the rise, so too have rates of suicide. This has led University of Virginia sociologist Bradford Wilcox to suggest that suicide is highest and climbing fastest among precisely those men whose ties to the social fabric have become most attenuated. Wilcox also argues that men don't thrive as rugged individualists, making their mark on the frontier. In fact, men seem to be much more likely to end up killing themselves if they don't have traditional support systems, end quote. Like Durkheim, our age faces numerous social factors which contribute to cultural anomie. For example, in just the course of 40 years, we have seen an upheaval in economic arrangements, the decline of traditional social morality, and the rise of technological empowerment, to name just a few. And of course, these three are not necessarily isolated or mutually exclusive, but frequently encourage one another. These three social factors, economic upheaval, decline in traditional morality, and technological empowerment, correspond to the separation of the individual from traditional social bonds in some ways that I think are worthy of our attention here. The Atlantic recently ran a cover story that highlighted perhaps the greatest economic change in our age. We are in the beginning stages of an era of technological unemployment in which computer scientists and software engineers essentially invent us out of work, and the total number of jobs declines steadily and permanently. What happens when this occurs? The article points to a Durkheimian answer. Quote, two of the most common side effects of unemployment are loneliness on the individual level and the hollowing out of communal pride. We have already begun seeing some of the effects. Wilcox points to research on suicide in America, which indicates that unemployed men are 126% more likely to kill themselves than employed men. He notes, quote, the deteriorating economic fortunes of poor and working class men have likely played a key role in recent spike in suicide among middle-aged men without college degrees. Remember, men are more likely to kill themselves than women. Wilcox also points to the decline in marriage in America as another likely social factor in increased rates in suicide, especially among those without college degrees. According to Wilcox, research indicates that, quote, unmarried men are about 240% more likely to kill themselves compared to their married peers. Thus, in all likelihood, the nation's dramatic retreat from marriage among less educated men in recent years has also had a hand in rising rates of suicide among this group of men, end quote. If Durkheim is correct that both traditional morality and dense families offer an immunization against suicide, the increasing cultural irrelevance of the traditional family is certainly worthy of our attention in our national conversation about suicide. Additionally, technological power and the possibility of virtual life may also be contributing to increased rates in suicide. A recent article in the magazine Medium details the phenomenon. Quote, in 1998, the author writes, Carnegie Mellon researchers warned that the internet could make us into hermits. They released a study monitoring the social behavior of 169 people making their first forays online. The web surfers started talking less with family and friends and grew more isolated and depressed. A quote in the article says, we were surprised to find that what is a social technology has such antisocial consequences, said one of the researchers at the time. And these are the same people who, when asked, described the internet as a positive thing, end quote. The fact of this nationwide trend towards isolation and loneliness are well documented. As Emily Esfahani-Smith points out, in 1985, when the General Social Survey asked Americans about the number of confidants they had in their lives, the common response was 3. The survey was given again in 2004, and the most common response was 0. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone famously documented the issue of social atomization. In an essay for the New Republic, Judith Shulevitz observes that 1 in 3 Americans over 45 identifies as chronically lonely meaning lonely most of the time. The number was just 1 in 5 just a decade ago. Ross Douthat has called our age a loneliness epidemic. Following the suicide of Robin Williams in 2014, Andrew Solomon wrote in The New Yorker that suicide is a crime of loneliness. The data support this observation, and indeed it should come as no surprise that the rise in loneliness across demographics in the U.S. correlates with the rise in suicide. And this brings us to part 3. What I hope to establish here is this. If it is true that A, the act of suicide is in some way dependent on the social structure, that B, the social structure is a reflection of the collective conscience, and C, that the collective conscience is itself a system of philosophical, ethical, and theological rules and assumptions which govern society, then we should at least briefly survey the set of philosophical and political assumptions which contribute to what we call modernity, and especially liberalism, modernity's primary social philosophy. Michael Scherer recently wrote, quote, "To be modern is to be aware of oneself, to be reflective about oneself, as standing at the end of a tradition, and as breaking from that tradition precisely by coming awareness to it." Certainly, this definition can be applied to Machiavelli, and later Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Mills, and the philosophers of liberalism. To consciously move beyond the Aristotelian philosophical tradition which animated the late medieval imagination, to reflect on one's being and his society as it is, not as it ought to be aware of the past, and to confidently proceed in spite of it. This is true of the secular liberal mind. I would argue, and maybe Durkheim's research would also suggest, that this is true of the Protestant mind. Central to liberalism is the freedom of the individual to define his own being, to decide his place in the world, emancipated from the constructions and traditions of human society, free to realize himself on the basis of his own understanding. Mill argues in On Liberty, in the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. This language of individual freedom as the summum bonum of the individual even affects the very decision to commit suicide. It is, after all, emancipation that the Dutch Journal of Psychiatry cites as being the fundamental principle by which an individual should have the right to choose suicide for whatever reason that individual determines. So we should not be surprised that actual functioning of modern society reflects this philosophical emancipation of the individual and the devaluing of traditional morality and community. And finally, I'll wrap it up with part 4, the possibility of forgiveness as a social principle by which we can begin to address our suicide epidemic. I said earlier that liberal democracy lacks a function by which it administers forgiveness. What I mean by that is this. There is on the one hand liberalism's theoretical maximization of the individual will, and on the other, liberalism's strict standards of conduct and belief. It is furthermore the function of liberal democracy to demand that all trespasses against it be made public. If a member of the community violates socially agreed upon standards, he or she must be served with public scorn and even punishment. I'm not saying simply that the virtues and vices are socially defined, but that the virtues and vices of the individual are in liberal democracies laid bare for public judgment. Consider the CEO of Mozilla, who was fired after public outrage over his particular vice, supporting Proposition 8 in California to defeat the same-sex marriage ballot. His freedom to have his own belief only extends so far. Since liberal democracy can only view individuals as citizens, sins against the liberal polity must be treated in the only way such a body can, through punishment, whether administered by the government proper or more often by majority public opinion. To me, and to be clear, this is now my own personal philosophical speculation, not supported by any data. It does not surprise me that Durkheim observes that Catholicism has lower rates of suicide than Protestantism for this very reason. In Protestantism, we see prefigured the democratic urge to reveal the sins of the members of the community. Hawthorne examined this reality of the American project in Scarlet Letter. The New England Puritans demand a public account of individual sins, yet without communal means of forgiveness, the only adequate response is punishment and social exclusion. It is no surprise that the adulteress Hester Prynne, the isolated bearer of the Scarlet Letter, considers suicide, which, I should add, she decides against out of duty to her daughter. Contrast this liberal and Protestant inability to forgive with Catholicism. It is true that sin damages the community. However, sin is not necessarily a public spectacle, but can be forgiven anonymously through the sacrament of confession, that awesome power given to God by God to his church. It is this act of forgiving that the community says to the individual, "Give me your worst self, and I will make you whole again." The forgiveness of the church has as its purpose the reconciliation of the individual to both his community and to God. In Catholicism, then, forgiveness administered by the community of the church on God's authority is essential not only for the individual's relationship to God, but for the proper integration of individual and his community, without which he is isolated, excluded, and judged. Without this power of communal forgiveness, we must resort to scorn, to suspicion, to exclusion. And so if our attempt at remedying the causes of suicide must consider repairing the tears in our collective conscience and constructing a more just social structure that better integrates individual and community, perhaps we should consider the communal virtue of forgiveness. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Give me liberty and give me death. I'm obviously borrowing here from Patrick Henry, one of the leading advocates of the American Revolution. Now, I'm not here this morning to talk about the American Revolution, but if you'd like to know why it was unjust, then perhaps you might like to read my paper in the Journal of Catholic Social Thought for 2009. So today, I was going to talk about responses to proposals to legalize physician-assisted suicide in the US and in the UK. But in a slight change to the advertised program, I thought it would be more appropriate if I spoke to a paper on which I worked when I was the Remick Fellow here last year, and which is going to be published shortly. And this paper is a response to Professor Emily Jackson. Together we contributed to this book, Debating Euthanasia, in which she wrote half of the book in favor of legalizing euthanasia, and I wrote half the book against. But our essays were written blind, so I didn't know what she was writing. So my contribution to the book considers 10 common arguments in favor of legalization and why they're unpersuasive. And I did say in my half of the book, when I'd read Professor Jackson's contribution, I would reply to it. So what you're going to hear today is a distillation of my reply to her case for the legalization of euthanasia and why I think her case is unpersuasive. Now, the paper will be published next year in a festschrift in honor of Professor Peter Skegg. He is one of the leading medical lawyers in the world. He's from New Zealand, and this book is being published in his honor. It's published by Oxford University Press, so you'll be able to read this paper, if you like, in that book. I expect it'll be published in the middle of next year. So today I will just give you edited highlights, as it were. In particular, I'm going to talk about 6 main criticisms I have of Professor Jackson's argument in the book Debating Euthanasia. So that was the book published by Hart Publishing 2011, 2012. We'll look firstly at her case, and then the book also then looks at my case against 10 arguments that are commonly put in favor of euthanasia. So if you'd like just a summary of what the leading arguments for euthanasia are and why they're unpersuasive, then you might like to read my half of the book. And what we're going to look at today is my reply to the case Professor Jackson raises in the first half of that book. And I have these criticisms of her contribution. She fails, firstly, I argue, to advance a clear or consistent ethical case in principle for voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And by voluntary euthanasia, we're talking about the administration of lethal injections to patients with the intention of ending their life at their request. And physician-assisted suicide, doctors intentionally giving assistance to patients to end their own lives. So she fails to advance a clear and consistent ethical case in favor of those practices. Secondly, she fails to rebut the core ethical principle supporting the current law in most jurisdictions in the world, which prohibits voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. And that core ethical principle is the inviolability of life, previously referred to commonly as the sanctity of life. Thirdly, she fails to rebut the key moral and legal distinction between intending death and merely foreseeing death. Instead, she confuses intention and foresight. Fourthly, she fails to give an adequate answer to the logical slippery slope argument, which I'll explain later. Fifthly, she fails to give an adequate answer to the empirical or practical slippery slope argument, which I'll touch on later, particularly in the light of the disturbing evidence from the Netherlands and Belgium, which have legalized both voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. The evidence there shows widespread breach of their safeguards with virtual impunity. And finally, she fails to articulate and defend a concrete proposal for legal reform. So let me say a little about each of those criticisms. Firstly, the vague basis of her ethical case for relaxation of the law. Her opening paragraph helpfully summarizes the core of her argument. She writes, "We owe it to people who experience permanent and irreversible suffering and to those who justifiably worry that this lies ahead of them, to do all that we can to alleviate their distress. And in a very small number of cases, she writes, this may entail allowing people who cannot be helped in any other way and who believe that death offers the only possible release from their suffering to have their lives ended quickly and painlessly. She goes on that decisions about how we die are significant and deeply personal issues of conscience. And in a free society, individuals must be allowed to make those decisions for themselves. What then is the ethical basis of Professor Jackson's case for relaxation of the law? Is it respect for autonomy, in the sense that we should respect significant and deeply personal issues of conscience about how people want to die, decisions which reflect their personal convictions? Well, if that is the basis of her case, why should suffering, let alone permanent and irreversible suffering, be a requirement for euthanasia? Such suffering may explain a person's wish for euthanasia, but it need not. People may want to die for all sorts of reasons unconnected with such suffering. If, as seems to be the case, Professor Jackson supports a requirement of unbearable suffering, why doesn't this amount to the imposition of her convictions on people who are not suffering unbearably, but nevertheless wish to end their lives? Or is the basis of her moral case beneficence, the duty to benefit others, which duty is thought to be discharged by ending their permanent and irreversible suffering that can't otherwise be alleviated? If this is the basis of her case, what type of suffering would qualify, and suffering to what degree? She relates the moving testimonies of several patients with seriously disabling conditions like motor neuron disease and locked-in syndrome who wanted accelerated death. But it's far from clear that her arguments would limit eligibility for euthanasia or assistance in suicide to such severe conditions. She notes, for example, empirical evidence from Oregon, which allows physician-assisted suicide, indicating that the main motivations for seeking have been, first, loss of autonomy, and, close behind, a decreasing ability to participate in activities that make life enjoyable. Well, she nowhere criticizes these as insufficient reasons, and if she regards them as sufficient, they are quite some distance from the stories of the gravely disabled patients, which she uses to front her case. And it is, moreover, far from clear that her criterion of suffering would exclude cases of so-called existential suffering, such as that of the healthy elderly person whose friends have died and who feels desperately lonely. And it was very interesting to hear Christopher's excellent paper in which he talks about the importance of a feeling of loneliness as a motivation for feeling disconnected, feeling isolated, and wanting to end one's existence. Such suffering is thought by many in the Netherlands, including the former Minister of Health, who was the architect of their law, to be a sufficient moral justification. She said very old people who are desperately lonely should be able to obtain suicide pills. Professor Jackson writes that even if inadequate pain management should be a thing of the past, it's much less clear that palliative care can alleviate the psychosocial consequences of bodily decline. And she adds that extreme dependency may also prompt requests for death. But many patients, especially elderly patients, may suffer the psychosocial consequences of bodily decline or be extremely dependent on others. Does she think that either is a sufficient ground for euthanasia or assisted suicide? Questions arise not only as to the type of suffering that she thinks justifies euthanasia, but also the degree. Suffering which is permanent and irreversible may well vary in degree. Occasionally the words intolerable or unbearable or horrible appear in her writing, but it's unclear if she intends these as requirements, and if she does, what she means by them. And how is unbearability to be determined? Is it not essentially a subjective notion? And if so, what limit does it place on the availability of euthanasia? She writes, I would maintain that the true expert in relation to the existence or otherwise of unbearable suffering is the patient herself, which again suggests it is essentially a subjective notion. Further, one might ask, why limit euthanasia to those who could bear their suffering, but would rather not? Unless we have a pretty clear idea of the type and degree of suffering which are thought to justify euthanasia, can we conclude, as she does, that the number who would qualify is likely to be very small? She proposes euthanasia in certain limited circumstances, but the limits seem very ill-defined. Finally, if beneficence is thought to be the justification for euthanasia, the relief of suffering, does it not justify ending the lives of those who are suffering but who are incompetent to request it, so-called non-voluntary euthanasia, as is now judicially approved in the Netherlands in the case of disabled newborn babies? Or is the basis of her case a combination of beneficence and respect for autonomy? If so, why insist on a request? Why deny the incompetent relief from suffering merely because they cannot request it? So I think her case is vague, unclear. A second criticism I have is her evasion of the main principled argument against relaxation of the law. She fails to refute the core moral objection to euthanasia, that it offends the fundamental principle of the inviolability or sanctity of human life. What of the argument that the prohibition on intentionally killing patients is, as the House of Lords Select Committee on Medical Ethics nicely put it in 1994, the cornerstone of law and of social relationships, which protects each one of us impartially, embodying the belief that all are equal? Well, in brief, Professor Jackson's attempted refutation of this foundational principle of Anglo-American law is brief and oblique. Thirdly, Professor Jackson conflates intention and foresight. She says there's no significant moral difference between a doctor intentionally shortening a patient's life by lethal injection and a doctor engaging in other medical conduct, such as switching off life support machines or administering palliative drugs, which foreseeably shorten life or may foreseeably shorten life. She says there's basically no moral difference between these practices. Whether the doctor intends to shorten life or merely foresees the shortening of life, they're morally equivalent. But this argument proves, firstly, too little. Too little in that it elides a key ethical distinction between trying to shorten life and merely foreseeing the shortening of life, between trying to kill the patient and trying to kill the pain, a distinction long recognized by the medical profession, including the Dutch medical profession, the pioneers of euthanasia, for whom euthanasia involves the intentional shortening of life, not merely the foreseen shortening of life. The distinctions also recognized in English and American criminal law, and, last but by no means least, by common sense. But her argument also proves too much. Too much first if she thinks, as she appears to, that the law relating to lethal injection should take its cue from the law permitting the withdrawal of treatment and requiring request for patient refusals of treatment, respect for patients' refusal of treatment. Because the law permits treatment to be withdrawn from patients both competent and incompetent. So should the law relating to lethal injections? If not, why not? And she also takes the view that patients have a legal right to refuse treatment for rational reasons, irrational reasons, or no reasons at all. Should then the law allow patients an equivalent right to lethal injections for rational reasons, irrational reasons, or no reasons at all? If not, why not? Fourthly, Professor Jackson gives an inadequate response to the logical slippery slope argument. And this argument runs that if autonomy and beneficence are thought to justify a lethal injection in the case of a suffering patient who requests it, then beneficence equally justifies a lethal injection in the case of suffering patients who lack the capacity to request it. The absence of an autonomous request does not negate the doctor's duty of beneficence. So in short, in the case of voluntary euthanasia, she could say there are two reasons for giving the patient a lethal injection. One, they want it, so we're respecting their autonomy. And secondly, it's good for them because it puts them out of their misery. But if those are two valid arguments, then in the case of the incompetent patient, the first can't apply because they're not autonomous, but the second still applies. We still have the duty to put them out of their misery. So there is a logical connection between endorsing voluntary euthanasia and endorsing non-voluntary euthanasia. And given the obviously compelling force of this logical argument, few philosophers have attempted to rebut it. Many, probably most, perhaps all leading philosopher advocates of voluntary euthanasia all support non-voluntary euthanasia as well. Professor Jackson does attempt to rebut the argument, albeit rather half-heartedly. She says, it's true that doctors are sometimes entitled to treat a patient without consent, as where the patient is incompetent. But it would be possible for assisted dying, I don't use the phrase she does, to be a special case which could be carried out only following a patient's explicit request. But her attempt to rebut the logical argument is unconvincing. The reason that she seems to offer for making euthanasia a special case, you can only do it on request, is that euthanasia involves another person, the doctor. But this argument obviously won't do, because doctors are involved in benefiting incompetent patients in many other situations as well. So her response to the logical argument is not only illogical, it is indeed baffling, because, as she implies in her contribution to debating euthanasia, and is clear in her other works, she actually endorses non-voluntary euthanasia. So her rejection of the logical argument seems not only unconvincing, but contradictory. Fifthly, her response to the empirical slippery slope argument is also unconvincing. She argues that the empirical slippery slope argument runs like this, so that if you legalize voluntary euthanasia, you'll have an increase in the numbers of non-voluntary euthanasia. But because we don't know the numbers before legalization, this empirical argument can't be made out. And she's, in a sense, right. We don't really know how many cases of voluntary and non-voluntary euthanasia there were in the Netherlands before they legalized voluntary euthanasia. But the empirical argument really needn't take that weak form, and in the work of myself and other scholars opposed to legalization, it doesn't take that form. The version of the empirical argument I and others use is that given the grave difficulty in drafting and policing voluntary euthanasia, it would prove difficult, if not impossible, to ensure that euthanasia was carried out only on request, that requests were truly autonomous, and that euthanasia was truly a last resort in cases of so-called unbearable suffering. This form of the argument does not depend on proving statistical increases of euthanasia without request after legalization, though it's perfectly consistent with the view that such an increase, not only in voluntary but also non-voluntary euthanasia, will occur. Now, the Dutch initially claimed that their guidelines were sufficiently strict to prevent non-voluntary euthanasia, but it later emerged from their very own surveys that their guidelines had wholly failed to prevent non-voluntary euthanasia on a wide scale. The empirical evidence disproved the key Dutch claim that their guidelines would ensure effective control. So this form of the empirical argument, which doesn't depend on demonstrating statistical increases, is one which advocates of relaxation, like Professor Jackson, need to refute as much as they need to refute its logical cousin. And this they have so far failed to do. And finally, surprisingly, in her contribution to the book, there is an absence of a concrete legal proposal for reform. She fails to produce a concrete proposal for reform, let alone one which meets concerns about the feasibility of effective control. She writes that none of the objections to legalization is sufficiently compelling to justify a refusal even to attempt to devise an effective assisted dying law. And her modest argument is that we should at least try. A refusal to contemplate legalization, she says, has costs and negative consequences. Well, this prompts two responses. First, legalization has been repeatedly contemplated in the United Kingdom. The first bill was introduced into the House of Lords as early as 1936. And over the last 20 years, we've had several attempts to legalize physician-assisted suicide. We've had a number of important select committee reports, volumes of evidence. So it's not been for want of trying that euthanasia hasn't been legalized. So far from refusing to contemplate legalization, that case has been repeatedly contemplated by expert committees and legislators in the UK and beyond, and with relatively few exceptions, rejected. Secondly, despite her argument that we should try to devise an effective law, she does not try to do so. The relevant part of her essay is entitled, "What Might an Assisted Dying Law Look Like?" But by the end of that part of her essay, we're scarcely any the wiser. She mentions various considerations for and against certain types of reform, but is reticent about which type of reform she actually favours. So that seems to me another challenge that advocates of reform must rise to producing a coherent, concrete proposal for reform. Finally, in her early work, as I mentioned earlier, she was much more open in favour of her support of non-voluntary euthanasia. And we're left scratching our heads as to whether she thinks the law should permit non-voluntary euthanasia. She doesn't retract her earlier condemnation of non-voluntary euthanasia, but it's much more implicit in her contribution to this book. Perhaps because if one is openly in favour of non-voluntary euthanasia, then it's much more difficult to persuade people to accept voluntary euthanasia. She does say at one point, if the justification for assisted dying is compassion, then it would seem odd to be compassionate only towards those who happen to have mental capacity. We have to address the question, she writes, whether we are limiting access to people with mental capacity because that's the only law that's politically feasible, or whether we genuinely believe that these are the only circumstances in which assisted dying is legitimate. So she says we have to address that question, but she does not address that question in the book. She leaves it hanging, that key question about the limits of a proposed or a reformed law. So producing an ethically coherent and workable proposal for reform which will ensure effective control is a central challenge to which any advocate for reform must rise, and Professor Jackson does not do so. So in short, it seems to me Professor Jackson's argument for reform, which is typical of arguments for reform advanced around the world, is deeply flawed. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming out so early on a Saturday morning when you could have been doing other things. And it's a pleasure to be with you and to share my experiences to share a little bit about my own experiences dealing with areas around the issue of basically the ending of the as I call it here in my title, the problem of freedom for facing death. I draw on my experiences and I share a little bit of my thinking in order to do so. First, I want to acknowledge that I have no financial disclosures to make. I would that I did, but I don't. And this is strictly on the a labor of love, as I guess it is for many people in this room as well. I do have two people to thank in particular, though. One of them is Judith Gordon, who is a sociologist in the clinical faculty at Yale in psychiatry, who has led my thinking in a sociological direction, and another colleague, Bandy Lee, who is a fellow forensic psychiatrist and who has turned me on to issues having to do with global analysis. In other words, the need to have a global view of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, rather than a restricted, narrow view that we are more accustomed to. I'd like to divide this into 5 parts, my experiences discussing the issue of end-of-life care, and noticing that it's becoming more and more of a buzzword in today's discussions and among physicians and among people in general. The issue of how to take care of people at the end of their life is becoming more and more vexing and more often discussed. Next, I want to talk about what's called whole brain death, the partial efforts to deal with end-of-life care through the definition of brain death without the cessation of respiration or heartbeat. Then I want to talk about, in a little bit more depth, the rise of the palliative care, which has been touched on just recently by both of the other speakers. And then a little bit about the ethical and religious directives, which most of you are probably familiar with. It's a small pamphlet that the Catholic Hospital Association has put out and the bishops have endorsed. And finally, a thing or two about what we might do ourselves in response to these ideas and these concerns. So getting back to my own experience, initially, I think the end-of-life care subject matter has gone through 3 phases in my own life, and perhaps you can relate to this. Initially, when I was back still in medical school, at the date that you heard in the introduction, I won't repeat the date that I graduated from medical school, but it was a while back. And at that time, some of you will remember that there was a debate about kidney dialysis machines, as we called them at that time. Now we call it hemodialysis. It sounds more expensive than it is. And at that time, there was a scarcity, and there were a lot of debates about what to do with that scarcity. And then there was an age of mindless, what I call mindless abundance, where such outrageous things were carried on as transplants in 90-year-old people and intubation and prolongation of life of people with metastatic cancer. Many the famous legal cases of Cruzan and Shivo, of course, are familiar with, most of you are familiar with. Really an overdoing of things. And thirdly, the stage that I think we're in now, which is a globalization stage, that we are aware of the global impact of what we do more and more often, I mean, in more and more areas. So the issue of scarcity, we experienced in medical school when we didn't have, at that time, a real serious medical ethics course. And we went to the dean's office and we said, we'd like to get medical ethics going as part of our curriculum. And the answer of the dean was, well, go ahead. Call upon any faculty you would like to be the speakers and organize your own course and do it. So we did. And when we came time to debate the issue of distribution of scarce resources like the dialysis machines, some of you may be familiar with this, but we would talk about the woman with 5 children and struggling single-mothered. The father was deceased, and she needed dialysis in order to survive and to be able to take care of her family, versus a ne'er-do-well who is an alcoholic and other things that are not worthy of being discussed in a group like this, and people in between, the children and so on. And we debate over who should get the scarce resource, because whoever gets it will live and whoever doesn't get it is going to die. And we couldn't come up with anything. We ended up, as bright as I think we were as a group, the best we could come up with was a lottery. And we felt this was the best way to handle the situation. And that was a time that has passed now to, through an age of this mindless abundance that I'm talking about. It was fueled by, I think, autonomy. Autonomy, as many of you would agree, has been over-exaggerated when we talk about bioethical issues in general and decision-making around the end of life. A little too much emphasis has been going in that direction, and we are. It reaches extremes like one of the extremes it reaches is a thing called medical tourism. Are you familiar with that term, medical tourism, where people will? There are really 2 kinds. One is where a person needs an operation or thinks they do, and it can't be obtained legally in the country that they're in. They'll go to another country where it is still legal and have it done and then come back. And this is something that I think does take place. It's hard to do a measurement of that or to really tell any data on it, but obviously it goes on. Also, there's a brain drain going on where people come from what we call the global medical south versus the global medical north. We're in the global medical north, of course, most of us, and we can send out. We can be tourists, We can be medical tourists if we need to be in order to get the treatment that we need. However, most people can't do that, and then the issue of brain drain I mentioned. This again, the abundance that we have of resources leaves people who probably would practice in their own countries where they were made to do that, but instead they come to this country or other countries in the medical north and to get their training and stay, and ignoring the needs back home, if you will, in the medical south. And it turns out we become more and more aware, do we not, that the decisions we make here impact the whole world. We can't any longer imagine that we just decide on whether a person should have this or that kind of intervention at the end of life on the basis of the local effects, which is what we're used to thinking of all too often. But we have to go on to consider what impact it has over the whole world. And that's true in many areas of our life. It has to do with the environment and how decisions that we make will affect future generations in terms of pollution or other degradation, loss of species, all things like this. It wasn't a part of our dialogue before, but now it is. And I think it has to increasingly become so, that the impacts we make at the bedside, deciding on what to do, we have to take into account the impact that it has beyond the bedroom, even beyond the country that the situation is going on in, and realize the global impacts of many of the things that we get ourselves into. We are, in other words, we're all connected to one another. For example, not only climate change, but vaccination refusal is another thing that gives an example of this, I think. The choice to vaccinate or not to vaccinate does not just influence the individual or the child who's going to get the vaccine or not, according to the parents' wishes, but it influences all the other people to whom that child is exposed and whom that child exposes, if you will. It's not just our own decision, the parents' decision. Take the spread of Ebola virus is another thing where decisions that were made locally have a global impact, and this can be very difficult to follow. But it's important to, as we make choices in this area, to take into account the worldwide impact of it. Diseases like tuberculosis and polio, we know, is now almost all gone. But there's a disease like tuberculosis, although it's medically more difficult to track, as you know, some of you anyway. But we could be much further along than we are with regard to that if choices were made to put resources into the treatment and the quarantining and so on that would really relieve the world of a scourge that's all too prevalent. So if we make unwise choices, then we affect not only the part of the world that's immediately around us, but we affect everyone. Aside from globalization, another aspect of end-of-life care that has come to the forefront, I think, is the issue is around the development of definition for whole brain death. We used to talk about brain death, now we talk about whole brain death, or WHB for short. And we're trying to, as a profession, learn exactly how to define that. It used to be that you would just simply do a neurological evaluation, the details of which are fairly well established. The person has to have no perception of pain when you give a strong pain stimulus, and then you have to study the brainstem through various maneuvers, moving the head and seeing how the eyes respond, and pouring ice water into the ear canals and seeing if you get what's called nystagmus in the opposite direction, and so on. The person who has none of these reactions can be called brain dead, but what makes the whole brain either dead or not is more difficult, because now we can see through the kinds of electroencephalograms that we are capable of doing that measure very fine changes, that there is activity going on in the brainstem. And there's a whole field opening up now, I think, where we can predict with some confidence who is going to get better and who is not going to recover over a long period of time by the level of response that their brainstem will show in a more refined way than you can do with maneuvering the head and pouring ice water and things like that. Through taking measurements with the electroencephalogram with a precision that was not possible until recently. Also using other kinds of scanning, as you may have heard of, functional MRI, for example, can allow us to distinguish between a person who is brain dead and is going to stay that way, and has very limited prognosis, very grim prognosis, in other words, versus the person who looks the same but has a different pattern of scanning of these kinds, and therefore has a better prognosis and might, if sustained artificially long enough, actually experience a significant recovery, and clearly demonstrating that they're not dead. In other words, the dead donor debate is the name of this area of discussion. If the person is dead, then obviously they can be a donor, but if they're too dead, then they can't be a donor because the organs will not be suitable for transplant. So how does the organ get removed and delivered in time without killing a person from whom it is taken? A very delicate issue, and this kind of ability to scan more sharply and define and distinguish among different levels for different patients, we will have more confidence, I think, in deciding who can be a donor and who can't be. We also have to recognize that there are different meanings for death that we, in different religions, in different cultures, we have different understanding of death, and it is in accord with our view of what the purpose of human life is about. I think we define death according to what we think our life is for. And among Christians, at least in our tradition, the purpose of human life, of course, is union with God. That's the ultimate purpose for which we are alive. And it's important to remember that, I think, when we make these decisions as well. Now on to the third part, the rise of palliative care. Here, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the terms POLST and MOLST. Anybody familiar with those? They're legal terms that are being debated in some legislatures. It's been defeated in Connecticut, I think 2 years now running, but I think in some other states it's made more progress, but it's really, I don't know of any instances of where the law is actually in place. It is. Now, is it POLST or MOLST? Okay, POLST stands for Physician Orders for, what is it? Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment, POLST. And that can be used to declare the limits of care that are appropriate for the particular patient. Then you have MOLST, M-O-L-S-T. Now that MOLST, what is the difference? That stands for Medical Orders to sustain life-sustaining treatment. And medical means not a physician, but another professional. And that gets to be a little bit more scary for some of us, not so much for others, as to what level of training is required to be able to validly write the orders that basically limit the person to palliative care and describe the details of how the palliative care is going to be carried out, what will and won't be done, in other words. But it can be done, it can be decided in some states by a non-physician medical person. And that is something that I think we have to keep an eye on. Another heading that is used in this area is called conscientious practice rules. So most hospitals now are developing policies under that heading of conscientious practice. Now, what conscientious practice is practice in the light of the scarcity of resources and the use of interventions that are appropriate or inappropriate. And some people think that they go too far, and it really takes an analysis case by case to see what is appropriate for each person, and there can be legitimate disagreements, of course, about that. That brings us to the fourth part, which has to do with the ethical and religious directives. And there's been a tendency, I think it's getting better now, but 10 years ago there was a misunderstanding that developed out of the Vatican that the Pope required feeding tubes in every patient. And the misunderstanding arose from a talk which he gave to a group of doctors, and it was blown out of all proportion beyond what I think anyone, including the Holy Father, intended at the time. This would have been Pope John Paul. And as we know, he died himself later. He went to the hospital the first time. About a week or two later, he had another episode and did not go to the hospital, and died in his quarters as he did. And this is considered a more powerful statement than anything that he wrote down about the issue when he was doing well, or just beginning, if you will, on the road to his end. So the phrase I think that captures it all very well is in the introduction in the third paragraph, where it says, "We have a duty to preserve our life and to use it for the glory of God, but the duty to preserve life is not absolute. We may reject life-prolonging procedures that are insufficiently beneficial or excessively burdensome." And of course, whether it's what is a benefit and what is a burden and how they are to be weighed depend entirely upon, or largely upon, the context in which the decision is evolving. And what is ordinary for one person will not be for another. It will be extraordinary for another person. And I like to think of it largely in terms of benefit. What is the purpose of it going to be? What is it going to do for the person? What is the best you can hope for? And how strongly is it legitimate to have that hope? And to make the decision on that basis and to be ready to respond to changes in the person's condition. In this regard, some things that come up are the capacity of the baby, for example, to experience pain. Newborns are put through an awful lot in the hopes that they will, especially premature newborns, are put through a great deal of pain and suffering in order to keep them alive and long enough to grow and develop into what they would have been had they been carried to term in the mother's womb. And there's a tendency, I think, to downplay the amount of pain that an infant can experience. On the other hand, it's a delicate area where I think we have to be very respectful of various opinions, and especially those of the parents in a situation like this. It can be, you can go through a lot of suffering, and the person can end up very much impaired. On the other hand, if the suffering if it leads to a successful outcome, it can be very much enhanced. But I don't agree with those who hold that babies don't experience pain. I don't know whether any of you have experiences like this, but as a medical student, I had to occasionally do a circumcision on a newborn, and I thought they felt pain based on the reactions they got. At least 4 out of 5 were screaming their little heads off. 1 or 2 seemed to sleep through the whole thing, but that was really the exception, and I'm not sure I would want to be in that exception, because in that group I don't know what their prognosis is for responding to normal stimuli. But I think the perception of pain is more difficult when it's an infant, but it also applies to adult pain. And sometimes it's difficult for us to communicate, and there's a lot of controversy about these smiling pictures that you have a sad face on one end and a series of those ideograms on the other, a very happy face on the other end, and the person has to point to which corresponds to their feeling. I'm not sure, most of those have not been held up very well under close scrutiny, but how do you tell an adult who can't speak and maybe can't hear, how can they tell us how much pain they're in or how much pain they're willing to contemplate? A difficult thing to decide. Very important, obviously, to remember the significance of intent. With the use of morphine is a classic example, of course. If you give too much morphine, the person will be free of pain, but the mechanism by which they're free of pain is that they are free of life. And that's really a misuse, if you will, of the principle of double effect, which you don't have time for, thank goodness, right now. But that is what comes up and has to be developed, and it's more difficult than when it was presented to us in college, I think. And we have to be up for that, if you will. So what can we do, finally, number 5? I think there are 2 areas where we can respond as individuals and as collectively. The first is simply in our own education, to continue intellectual formation in this area by some of the readings that have been suggested through the course of this conference, coming to conferences like this, the writings of the last 3 or 4 popes. I speak very casually here because some of the effects of the writing would be indirect, but I think very inspiring. Some of Pope John Paul's writing, for example, near the end of his life, are very inspired and have applications here that one can make through reflective reading of that kind of writing. And a lot of that, Pope Benedict also, a lot of things that he wrote on his own, very much admired, and I'm a little behind on that myself, I have to confess. But I would urge that as one thing we might do. And the other is very simply to take opportunities that we have to visit the sick in various ways. Volunteering for distributing communion, for example. I think, at least where I live and work, there's a scarcity of that. And there really should be an abundance of it. And some people would perhaps be needed also to supervise and to organize that kind of thing, or other kinds of visitations to those who are bound in hospitals, various kinds, including mental hospitals. We could really be of great help, and I think it would be good for our own souls as we face our own death eventually. Thank you.
Well, our presenters did a wonderful job of trying to stay within the time limits, which is very difficult in light of the topics that they had. We have a little time to take questions, so if anyone has any question, and if you direct it to the person that you want to ask, that would be helpful. Any questions?
Because two of the talks mentioned the double effect of use of morphine, I just wanted to direct to both those speakers a question that, while double effect is certainly a valid principle, it also has been said by a number of the physicians who are very experienced in palliative care that, in fact, it's also overemphasized by others as a real risk in the case where a patient has cancer, for example, has been on morphine. Morphine is being titrated up just to control the pain. There's very little risk, really, that morphine will end up suppressing respiration because it's all going to the pain receptors. And as long as you're careful to be doing that, the risk of shortening life is really very, very small. And I think that practical or empirical fact would be important for people to know because they overemphasized fear of doing that tends to end up with undertreatment of pain and more people who think euthanasia is their only choice. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Sure. In fact, I make that point, Richard, in all of my books. So in Euthanasia Examined, which I edited, CUP, 1995, one of the contributors, Robert Twycross, eminent palliative care doctor from Portsmouth, emphasizes that point. He says the idea that the administration of morphine does accelerate death is a persistent fantasy. And in my other books as well, I make the point. So quoting the people in the know who say this is just a common myth. And I think you're absolutely right. One of the dangers is that doctors might be too reluctant to administer proper palliative medication for fear of that effect and for fear of prosecution. I think some doctors misguidedly think they might be liable for crime of homicide. But the point I want to make is that even if it were the case that it did accelerate death, it would be perfectly lawful and ethical. But in reality, it doesn't if it's done properly. Yeah.
Richard, thank you for that nice update, because that is important. It's a concern not only for physicians, but for families that worry about this.
For the first two speakers in particular, my name is John Mullers, I'm arriving from Ireland. I just wonder if we're alert enough to the importance of phrases and language in these discussions about euthanasia and so on. Because what we find in this increasingly propagandistic and emotive atmosphere in which discussions are won and lost is that the language is key. For example, in Ireland we didn't call it gay marriage, we called it marriage equality. And that phrase exploded in many of the key constructs which you might have actually presented in order to defend the institutions as they were. So therefore, when you use a phrase like, for example, even the word euthanasia, the meaning of it is changing as we go along. And new variations like voluntary come in, which seems to be almost like an oxymoron in some respects. But in Ireland, for example, the right to die, we talk about the right to die. It seems to me we should fight these phrases because the word dying suggests a certain passivity. But clearly what we're talking about here is euthanasia imposed by society. It's an action imposed from outside of the person. And I don't think we're alert enough to, because in the emotive context where these can happen, I'll give you an example. In Ireland, we had a particular case where a woman was fighting to the courts for the right to die. She was wheeled into court every day by her husband. Eventually she did die. She lost the case, but they lost the case. But in actual fact, what was really happening, of course, was not that she was looking for the right to die. She had the right to die, as it were, the same as we all have. We don't have a choice. But the right of her husband to avoid consequences as a consequence of assisting her death. This is an entirely different philosophical question, and is much less prone to the emotive pummeling which these issues tend to take in the public arena now. So I don't think we should acquiesce in the kind of terminologies which are given to us, because by the time we realise the damage how damaging they are, we will have already lost the argument, as we lost the gay marriage argument in Ireland, precisely because of language and propaganda. You know, so, and I mean, simple an example as well. I mean, ask this question of yourself. If our societies had been less preoccupied with the moment of birth, the birthday of the child, would it have been so difficult to actually argue in favour of the life of the child in the womb? These issues are, of course, there are many deep scientific and philosophical issues, but they're very, very increasingly important because of the climate of propaganda we live in. The phraseologies we acquiesce in are central to how these discussions will go.
I think your comment about the specificity of language and not being fooled by the inappropriate use of language is very important, and our necessity to correct the inappropriate use of language.
Just give you one phrase. What if we were able to call it non-judgmental execution? How do you think that would go?
I think when I sit down, I'm going to write that down so that I can use it the next time I speak on this issue. Any of the speakers want to comment? Your comment was sufficient.
Just to endorse, the point about the importance of language, the phrase assisted dying is now dominant in the literature and in the media, and I think it's quite misleading because it's not helping people to die. That's what good palliative care does. It's intentionally shortening their life. So I use the phrase physician-assisted suicide rather than physician-assisted dying.
Yeah, and I think, as Professor McIntyre may have said, when we don't have kind of rational terms that we can kind of rationally discuss with one another, we just kind of revert to these God terms or devil devil terms that we use to promote our arguments through, like you said, propaganda essentially. So I don't know how to combat that. Just by using the word properly, does it help? I'm not sure, but certainly it's a problem.
Any other?
So within the Christian understanding, especially Catholicism, we have this understanding of suffering is not always the greatest evil, and you can unite that suffering to Christ and further understand the cross. But within the secular world, do you feel like there's this understanding of suffering as a necessary aspect of humanity, or is most of these conversations center around completely alleviating that suffering?
John? Present.
The latter. I think most of the discussion does have to do with trying to alleviate the suffering, and that's a good thing. I don't think we're meant to suffer needlessly. It's a noble thing, and one is free to do that, of course, to forego suffering and pain. But I wouldn't encourage that.
And suffering can be so great that it reduces your rationality, and we need to be very careful of that. And that's one of the things that medicine focuses on, because you want to, even whether you're Christian or not, you want to help people to be human as long as you possibly can. Yes?
In a world of cyber immortality, what would a concept of civil forgiveness look like?
In the context of, okay.
Of
Cyber
cyber?
immortality, what would forgiveness look like? So cyber immortality being essentially...
That everything once it's online is there forever.
Yeah, so, I mean, do you think that with cyber immortality you kind of endow your personality to your cyber persona or something?
Or I guess I'm just asking what civil forgiveness could look like.
Yeah, so I guess by forgiveness I mean essentially that forgiveness is the act by which the community integrates the individual into itself. So if community is simply cyber, it's simply virtual, I guess it doesn't necessarily need to practice forgiveness, I guess.
Well, do you have an idea of what it would mean? If you're part of a cyber community, what forgiveness would mean in that community? Or is this a new construct that we need?
Right, I guess it's hard to imagine how we can, forget these things. How the idea of forgiveness can be enacted in a world that remembers and documents everything.
But the original nasty comment stays there no matter what.
Right.
I want to ask John Keown on his 6 faults in Jackson's case. Number 1 in particular, would she have strengthened her case either persuasively or ultimately if she relied on one of those two, or are those two, autonomy and beneficence, always combined by advocates of assisted suicide? I mean, it just seems to me that autonomy is kind of pushed in this age, and there's more and more people committing suicide, and so there's more, and we're more and more isolated from one another. So there's a kind of a demand building up. I just wonder if the autonomy argument, if she would have strengthened, not that she's right, but she would have been more dangerous if she'd kind of drawn it on that.
Well, it would have been clearer, for one thing, if she'd focused on that. But of course, she's then in difficulty because at the heart of her case is also this emphasis on suffering, the alleviation of suffering. That seems to be what ultimately justifies it in helping to end someone's life. So if she were to focus on autonomy, I think then she'd have to lose that focus on suffering, and then I think the case would be much less appealing to many because it would be a right to death on demand.
Right.
But I think there's what her case shows, and I mean, she's a very good example of a leading advocate of euthanasia. Her argument is a very good illustration of the type of arguments put across, and it just shows this tension in the argument. Or what fundamentally is it about? Is it one or the other? Is it both? And what's the relation between the two? And I think it's unsatisfactory. But it's just not made clear how the two relate to each other.
Can I just say one more thing to add that? Because what I was wondering is, you know, the subjectivity issue, if that isn't really what's behind all this. So the beneficence, I mean, if you think your life's not worth living, that's the ultimate judgment. So it's in a sense an autonomy-based, not that it all reduces to that, but that's the main driver.
Well, as a matter of fact, listening to our presenters today, the autonomy issue, in the sense that you're separated from any human communities and from the web of human communities, seems to be played out in Oregon, because the suffering doesn't come in Oregon at this point. And the data that comes from Oregon says that most of the people who are committing physician-assisted suicide, most of them are males. Most of them are autonomous in the sense that they're not suffering, and so it's not a matter of beneficence, but they have this fear that they will lose their independence. They have this fear that they will lose the ability to enjoy the things that they've enjoyed in life. So they're not yet at the point where they're suffering, and they're not yet at the point where they're not enjoying. It's just this fear of this, and so it is autonomy. And it has been mostly males who have committed it and have taken part in it, and of a particular economic level, so they're not people who are worried about having the economy to support them in their dying. So it has been autonomy in Oregon that has really been at the root of it, and it has been males, and they seem to be outside of the web of sociality that Chris pointed out earlier. Other questions?
I'd just like to ask any speakers to comment on the social and political dilemma that we face. In Chris' presentation, we've emphasized loneliness as something that leads to suicide and disconnectedness, isolation. We as a society tend to value individual rights, autonomy, individual liberty, and we seldom talk communally about the common good. At least we don't talk about it in ways that rise to the level of political commercials and discourse. And my question is this: how would you propose? I mean, in the American tradition, we have Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's the goal. On the other hand, you've got the Constitution. We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. How would you propose to elevate consciousness of suicide as a social sin? That is to say, something that ruptures the fabric of our society as a whole. How can you elevate that into the public consciousness?
Yeah, I guess that may be one important part of preventing the increase in suicide, or it may just be restoring those social bonds themselves, and that, as an effect, could decrease the rates of suicide. So, you may approach the topic directly, or you may just go to the root of the cause itself, and try to work out these communal implications. I don't know, forgiveness may be part of that, but we're so far into the modern idea that there really is no common good other than the individuals in the community achieving their own end. And that's really just assumed. I teach students, and certainly that's their mental framework. Anything that puts a burden on them to have responsibility towards the community is immoral.
And that's a change in social structure in the United States. Tocqueville, when he came through the United States, noted very clearly how we had these voluntary associations that cared for one another. This was evident, too, in the great waves of immigration coming into this country, where these various social groups met the immigrants and integrated them into the community. One of the ways that I think we have to do it is by our practices. And by our practices first, and that's in the family, and that can extend by witness. But we also have to recover the power of the mediating institutions in the United States. Right now we have this, the individual versus the government, and we've lost the power of these mediating institutions. Marianne Glendon very, very carefully wrote about that in her book Rights Talk, and I think she had some warning signs on it for us 20 years ago, and some ways that we can do this. We do need to strengthen our mediating institutions in the United States. Any other comments?
Briefly, I think we need to expose the fallacy of the argument this is all about individual liberty. It's not about individual liberty, because even the advocates for relaxation of the law would limit euthanasia to certain cases. You've got to be dying, or you've got to have unbearable suffering. If you don't have those, then you don't qualify. So it's fundamentally about the judgment that certain people would be better off dead. And then you can see straight away, once you look at it through that focus, the implications, particularly for those with disabilities, who will be prime candidates for the designation that their lives aren't worth living. So I go back to that wonderful statement from the House of Lords Select Committee that the prohibition on intentional killing is the cornerstone of all social relationships, which protects each one of us impartially, embodying the belief we are all equal.
Well, with that, let's express our appreciation to the speakers.